While Nyesom Wike tours all 23 local government areas of Rivers State, thanking supporters and declaring that his Rainbow Coalition will, in his words, produce every single elective position in 2027, Governor Siminalayi Fubara has said almost nothing in public. But silence in Rivers politics is rarely empty. In May of this year, while Wike's allies were being screened for governorship forms in Abuja, Fubara's camp was quietly doing something else entirely, buying 32 nomination forms for loyalists to contest every seat in the Rivers State House of Assembly. Not one or two, 32. So here is the question nobody in the Port Harcourt press pool is asking out loud. Is Fubara actually losing this fight? Or is he running a slower, quieter campaign that the noise around Wike is drowning out? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, the answer may reframe everything you think you know about who actually controls Rivers heading into 2027. Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, welcome. Naija Insight Desk exists for one reason: to give you the kind of analysis that goes beyond the headlines and the noise. Subscribe now, because this conversation is about to get deeper. To understand what's happening now, you have to understand what already happened. Fubara and Wike's relationship collapsed within months of Fubara taking office in 2023, a fallout over control of party structures that escalated into defections, a burned-down House of Assembly chamber, and eventually a full declaration of emergency rule by President Bola Tinubu in March 2025. Fubara, his deputy Ngozi Odu, and the entire State House of Assembly were suspended. A sole administrator ran Rivers for 6 months. When emergency rule lifted in September 2025, it came with conditions. A peace deal brokered personally by Tinubu. Part of that arrangement, according to multiple reports, was that Fubara would defect to the APC and would not seek re-election in 2027. Fubara did defect in December, but the second half of that deal is now the entire fight. Because by May 2026, Fubara's allies were buying governorship expression of interest forms for him, the clearest signal yet that he intends to run again. Within days, Wike's camp countered by pushing forward his own preferred aspirants, Dax George Kelly on the APC platform and Kingsley Chinda on the PDP platform. This is not a new conflict wearing an old face. It's the same war, but the battlefield has shifted from public shouting matches to something quieter: form buying, committee composition, and legislative timing. 3 institutions matter most here, and each tells a different part of the story. First, the Rivers State House of Assembly. Speaker Martin Amwahule and 27 lawmakers loyal to Wike have already attempted to impeach Fubara 3 separate times since the crisis began, most recently in January 2026. Every attempt has been paused or blocked, twice by presidential intervention, once by a court injunction. That pattern matters because the Assembly holds the constitutional power to remove a governor, but every time it has tried to use that power against Fubara, an external actor, the courts or the Presidency, has stepped in to stop it. That tells you the Assembly's authority here is real on paper, but constrained in practice by the fact that Tinubu does not want another Rivers implosion this close to 2027. Just this past week, the Assembly flexed a smaller but telling form of leverage, approving Fubara's 2026 to 2028 medium-term expenditure framework, but only after publicly criticizing him for submitting it months behind the legal deadline. The framework passed, the public rebuke was the point. Second, the APC's national screening apparatus. In May, a screening committee chaired by Imo State Governor Hope Uzodimma processed governorship aspirants in Rivers. Reports describe Fubara receiving what multiple outlets called a cold shoulder during his session, while Wike's loyalists Dax George Kelly and Kingsley Chinda moved through without friction. But here's the ambiguity worth sitting with. Fubara is a sitting APC governor in his first term, and APC's national leadership has separately signaled that first-term governors get a right of first refusal on their party's ticket. If that rule holds, screening theater matters less than the formal nomination process, which still favors incumbency. Third, the presidency itself. Tinubu has now personally intervened in this crisis 4 times. Each time, his stated goal is stability, not necessarily loyalty to Wike or to Fubara. That distinction is important because it means the single most powerful institutional actor in this conflict has an incentive that doesn't perfectly align with either man's ambitions. Tinubu needs Rivers calm heading into 2027, not necessarily Wike's coalition victorious.
This is where Fubara's quiet counter-strategy actually becomes visible, once you know where to look. Start with the 32 assembly nomination forms. Wike's structural power in Rivers doesn't come primarily from the governorship. It comes from controlling the party machinery and the local government councils, where Wike-aligned chairmen currently hold 20 of 23 seats. If Fubara cannot dislodge that structure directly, the next best strategy is denying Wike a compliant legislature after 2027. 32 candidates across the state assembly constituencies is not a defensive move. It's an attempt to rebuild a loyal legislative bloc from the ground up, the same body that has tried to impeach him 3 times. Then there's the defection to APC itself. Critics frame it as capitulation to the peace deal, but it can just as easily be read as Fubara maneuvering onto the platform where the sitting president's authority, the one actor who keeps rescuing him, carries the most direct institutional weight. Every time Wike's coalition has pushed toward removing Fubara, it has been Tinubu, an APC president, who intervened. Being inside that same party gives Fubara more claim on that protection, not less. Now, weigh what Fubara loses. Reports indicate he dissolved his own grassroots structure, the Simplified Family, in the interest of peace, and that some of its most committed organizers left angry, with some reportedly joining Wike's coalition instead. That is a real cost. It suggests Fubara is betting on formal institutional leverage, incumbency, party rules, and presidential goodwill over the informal street-level networks that got him elected in the first place. That's a gamble, not a guaranteed win. Who is conspicuously quiet in all this? Fubara himself, largely. He has avoided directly rebutting Wike's public statements, even when Wike has called him, in his own words, an ungrateful child. Political analysts frame that restraint as strategic. Every time Fubara has stayed silent rather than escalate, it has denied Wike's camp a fresh provocation to justify another impeachment push. Whether that's foresight or simply the absence of the better option is something reasonable people can disagree on. And what does this signal for 2027 more broadly? It suggests Rivers is heading toward a primary battle rather than a negotiated handover. APC's own internal contest between an incumbent governor and Wike's chosen loyalists may end up mattering more than the general election itself. Now, if what you just heard challenges what you thought you knew, drop it in the comments. I want to hear your read on this before we get to the part that refrains everything. Zoom out from Rivers, and this fight is really a test case for a question every APC governor with a powerful godfather is watching closely. Does incumbency protect you, or does structural control of the party machine override it? The answer that emerges from Rivers will shape how governors in states like Kano, Delta, and Benue approach their own godfather relationships heading into the same election cycle. There's an economic dimension too. Rivers is Nigeria's second-largest oil-producing state and a critical revenue base for the federation account. Prolonged instability, a 4th impeachment attempt, another emergency rule, another disrupted budget cycle carries real fiscal risk, not just political risk. The late MTEF submission this year is a small preview of what governance paralysis looks like when energy is consumed by survival rather than planning. And for ordinary Rivers residents, the people Wike himself invoked when he mentioned cancelling a 10,000 youth employment scheme Fubara inherited, this fight has tangible costs. Contested budgets, dissolved programs, and diverted political energy all have downstream effects on service delivery in a state where poverty and unemployment remain pressing concerns regardless of who wins government house. For the Nigerian diaspora and Africa watchers more broadly, Rivers State is a useful lens on a pattern playing out across the continent, the tension between formal democratic institutions and informal godfather networks that persist after office holders leave power. It echoes dynamics seen in states from Lagos to Kano, where former governors retain outsized influence over their successors through party structures rather than elected office. It also matters for how international observers assess Nigeria's institutional maturity ahead of 2027. Repeated presidential interventions to prevent a state assembly from removing a sitting governor raise a genuine question. Is that presidential restraint protecting democratic stability, or is it substituting one man's judgment for the constitutional process that's supposed to resolve these disputes on its own? The strongest case against the Fubara is quietly winning framing deserves to be heard in full. Wike's supporters would argue correctly that he still controls the APC and PDP state chairmanships, 20 of 23 local government councils, and a clear majority in the House of Assembly. 32 nomination forms mean nothing if Wike's structure controls the party primaries that decide who actually gets on the ballot. By that read, Fubara's moves aren't a counter-offensive, they're symbolic gestures from a governor who has already lost the structural war and is simply trying to leave with dignity intact. A common misconception circulating online is that this is a simple two-man rivalry that will be settled by whoever wins one dramatic confrontation. It isn't. This is a multi-year contest over party machinery, legal timelines, and presidential patience, and it will most likely be resolved through the unglamorous mechanics of primary elections and candidate substitutions, not a single decisive showdown. The nuance worth holding on to: both sides have real institutional leverage and both have real vulnerabilities. Wike controls the machine but not the man in government house. Fubara controls incumbency but not the party structure beneath him. Neither side's victory is assured, which is precisely why the maneuvering keeps intensifying rather than resolving. What this ultimately means for Rivers' democratic trajectory is this: the outcome will hinge less on who is more popular with voters and more on which institutional lever, incumbency, party control, or presidential intervention, proves strongest when the primaries actually happen.
3 moves are worth watching in the coming weeks. First, whether APC's national leadership formally confirms the right of first refusal rule for first-term governors, which would significantly strengthen Fubara's hand regardless of Wike's preferred candidates. Second, whether the Assembly's approval of the MTEF signals a genuine, if grudging, thaw, or whether it's simply a tactical pause before renewed friction over the full 2026 budget. Third, whether any of Fubara's 32 Assembly loyalists face procedural obstacles during their own primaries, which would be the clearest sign yet that Wike's structural control is being used to blunt Fubara's legislative rebuilding effort before it starts. Escalation becomes likely if APC's national leadership sides decisively with Wike's preferred candidates over incumbency rules. That would remove Fubara's strongest institutional shield and could trigger a 4th confrontation. De-escalation becomes more likely if Tinubu, wary of instability this close to a general election, quietly signals that he wants Fubara left alone through the primaries. Looking further out, over the next 12 months, expect the real battle to play out inside APC's primary process rather than in public statements. Over a 3-year horizon, whoever wins the 2027 governorship will inherit a state house of assembly that is either still Wike-aligned or partially rebuilt around Fubara loyalists. And that legislative balance may matter more for how Rivers is actually governed than who holds the governor's title itself. So, is Fubara quietly countering the Rainbow Coalition? The evidence suggests yes, in the sense that he is building toward the 2027 primaries rather than conceding them. But countering is not the same as winning. He is playing a longer institutional game against an opponent who still controls most of the machinery on the ground. This isn't a prediction of who takes Rivers in 2027. It's an evidence-based read of where the real contest is happening. Not in the headlines, but in nomination forms, screening committees, and party rules that most viewers will never see reported in detail. If this analysis gave you clarity, not agreement, clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what's actually happening in Rivers State. And keep an eye on APC's primary calendar in the coming months, because that, more than any press conference, is where this fight will actually be decided. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.